Panel 4 is on using AI to enhance democracy. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Jakob Mökander.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you to everyone who's sticking with us today. I want to make a call back to the first panel. For those of you who were here in the morning, Kevin in the Q&A said, we also have to think about what we want to achieve with AI and what the normative goal should be. And one of the institutions we have for that is our deliberative democracy. And with me today to discuss that topic and how also AI can both transform and enhance those democratic processes, we have a wonderful panel with Michael Henry, with Hahrie, with Luke and Spencer. Thank you all for joining. Before we get into the presentation, perhaps you could introduce yourself briefly and also how you come to this topic so the audience also know the diversity we have in the panel.
Sure. Is this working? Yes. Oh, hi, everyone. My name is Michael Henry Tessler, but people call me MH, and I go by MH. I'm a research scientist at Google DeepMind, where I work on AI-mediated deliberation, which I'll tell you about soon. My background is in cognitive science, and specifically the intersection of psychology and linguistics, studying how humans use and understand language.
Hi, my name is Hahrie, and I'm a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. I lead an institute there called the Agora Institute that does a lot of work on democracy. My own background is on collective action and social movements and democracy reform.
Hi everyone, my name's Luke Thorburn. I'm a PhD student at King's College in London and a research fellow at the AI and Democracy Foundation. My background's in maths and stats, but my core PhD research has been on the impacts of recommender systems on social conflict and risks of conflict escalation. So a lot of my work is sort of touches on many different disciplines that intersect with that topic.
My name's Spencer Overton. I'm a professor at GW Law School. I'm also the faculty director and founder of the Multiracial Democracy Project there. My background is in voting rights. I was also in the Obama administration, and I took a leave from GW and led the Black think tank where we focused on some tech issues, in particular Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and some AI work.
Thank you all and welcome. Also, I didn't say on my end before we get into the presentation, I'm the Director of Science and Tech Policy at the Tony Blair Institute, a think tank that advises governments around the world on policy. And just one remark that we have seen in the last decade is that the very term democracy has in one sense gone out of fashion. When my colleagues advised governments 10 years back and they went to different countries, countries that had suffered a lack of democratic institutions would be apologetic about it. They say, we're getting there, it's a process. Now they say, you guys don't have your ship in order, we will figure out other ways. So the question is, on the one hand, how do democratic institutions themselves work? But the other is, how does also AI change the process of democratic deliberation? And I think that is really what we are here to discuss today. So if I can start with you, Jim.
Great, yeah. So I want to bring up something that Alondra brought up this morning, which is when discussing the AI Bill of Rights, she noted that the deliberative inputs that went into that process via stakeholder consultation was a kind of key part of it. And now I want us to imagine that public consultation like that could happen at a larger scale, engaging a more diverse public in a time-efficient manner that produces deliberative and actionable outcomes. And that's sort of the context in which this paper and this project takes shape. So this project, or this paper builds on work that we published in Science late last year on using AI to help people find common ground. And what this project looked at was a kind of human AI system where human participants submitted their opinions and iteratively critiques to an AI mediator, which generated and then revised its statements, with the goal of finding a group statement that would reflect the kind of diverse views of the group. And to kind of dig into the technical details a little bit, the AI mediator, which we called in this paper the Habermas machine, named after the deliberative democratic theorist Jürgen Habermas, who popularized the idea of deliberation for finding common ground in public discussion. The Habermas machine has three components to it. The first is a generative model. What this generative model does is it proposes different candidate group statements, basically taking in the discussant's opinions and trying out different group statements by trying out different wordings, different framings of the problem, perhaps different proposals. It then, inside of it, predicts how much each of the participants in the group would rank each of the candidate group statements. That is, if you had a ranked choice ballot from each participant, how would they rank the statements? Now, note this is happening inside the machine, so this is sort of a simulated election. The third part is kind of actually counting the votes, as it were, aggregating those rankings using a social choice rule, also known as a ranked choice election. So what the Habermas machine does is kind of simulates this election where it generates a number of candidates, it predicts kind of the votes for those candidates, and returns the winner. One of the features is that the number of candidates that could be simulated or generated or proposed could be very, very large. Here it's shown 16 candidates, but this number could be 1,600, which would be obviously prohibitive for any individual person to rank. To summarize what we found in this paper, we found that the AI-mediated protocol helped people find common ground. It outperformed humans playing the role of mediator in a number of dimensions, including the perceived neutrality of the statements, that the AI mediator was perceived to have more neutral statements, just based on the text. People didn't know that it wasn't AI. The mediated deliberation left groups less divided on the issues. The mediator, we found, responded to the critiques of the participants by addressing the minority viewpoint while still respecting the majority stance, which was an interesting mediation strategy that the model learned. Finally, we replicated these results with a demographically representative sample of people in the UK deliberating over controversial political issues. Now, in the paper for this symposium, we dive deeper into the question of, can AI mediation improve democratic deliberation? And one critical question we analyze is, what is missed by AI-mediated deliberation? In the protocol that we studied, it was a digital, fully mediated deliberation. What do I mean by that? I mean is that this was obviously taking place online, and it was fully mediated in that the participants did not interact with each other. They didn't see each other's opinions, but they sort of interacted via this AI mediator. Of course, we could imagine different kinds of deliberation protocols happening. For example, it could be a round-the-table discussion, and with like current AI systems, we could have an AI mediator listening to that round-the-table discussion and perhaps proposing different candidate statements for the group, if that's what's requested. And we could also have a partial mediation. So if in the round-the-table discussion, it's hard for it to be kind of like anonymous, because that's kind of the nature of round-the-table in-person discussion. But even in the digital space, you could have sort of attributes of kind of around-the-table discussion. And there are benefits to each of these. For example, if forming kind of trust and bond with the other discussants and the participants is important, then you would want to like consider those benefits. So that's just one kind of question we dive into in this paper. This is the list of the other questions. How do we ensure that an AI mediation process is fair? We analyze kind of technical protocols that could be established to establish for fairness, as well as addressing the kind of foundational question that we began with, which is like, will AI actually scale deliberation effectively? Can you actually have an effective large-scale deliberation mediated by AI? That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Hahrie next. As we turn a bit from computer science to political science and look at the people involved in and the publics involved in deliberation.
Right. Okay. Great. Oh, the slides are there. All right. So thank you so much. This is a paper that I did in collaboration with a colleague of mine at Johns Hopkins named Henry Farrell. And the paper actually, although we didn't have a chance to talk with Jillian about it, I think it builds off of a lot of Jillian's work in the sense that it starts with this view of individuals as being socially embedded with institutions and tries to take seriously like how we might think about this relationship between AI and democratic publics if we take that kind of social embeddedness and that dynamic relationship seriously. But we start from a different starting point, which is this idea that in thinking about the relationship between AI and democracy, first we have to have a conversation about how we understand what democracy is. And as a political scientist, there's many of us who have spent, hundreds of thousands of years, trying to debate, what democracy is. There's many definitions out there. And I think the point that we're trying to make in this paper is that there's an old joke about how, the drunk man is looking for his keys under the light, and that sometimes right now it feels like the work on the relationship between AI and and democracy more broadly is focused on where the light is shining most easily. But that is not necessarily what actually makes democracy work. And so part of what we want to argue for is that if we think about the different paradigms that underlie what our understandings of democracy are, that can point to directions that we might want to take the study of the relationship between AI and democracy. And so we start with kind of thinking about different paradigms of politics that exist out there. And we're setting these up as kind of straw men, so I know that they're not obviously as distinct as we're going to lay them out to be, but so they are set up as straw men, but the idea is that we're trying to make points. And so there's a as MH just talked about in his paper, there's a Habermasian kind of ideal that focuses on the deliberative role of politics, in which the ideal citizen is someone who is rational and disinterested and can make dispassionate, decisions about the political world. And that starts from a set of assumptions in which individuals, we tend to treat the formation of their interests and their preferences as relatively exogenous to the democratic process itself, right? That people come in, they have beliefs and they have preferences, and then and then aggregation is basically the additive sum of adding up people's preferences together. An alternative model, one that's grounded more in collective action, tends to treat politics as a practice in which the formation of identities, interests, and preferences are actually endogenous to the act of politics itself, and that in fact is what politics is. And so underlying each of these models is a distinct set of assumptions about how individuals behave and how they come together. So whereas one might be more individualistic and treat people as rational and disinterested, the other, I think, starts from assumption that people are inherently relational and interdependent, and that people, in fact, are self-interested, distracted, and socially embedded, right? They don't pay attention to politics. They're not making rational decisions about the political world. And so then it leads to a different set of assumptions about the way in which people contribute to the process. So in deliberative models, the participation that most people can do is what they're doing is they're expressing their views. So whether it's through a vote, whether it's through signing petitions, whether it's through standing on a soapbox in the public square, right? What they're doing is they're expressing a set of preferences that they want to see enacted in the political world. Whereas in a more interdependent model of politics, then it's not that people's participation is not just about expression, but it's also about negotiation, right? So I come into it, and because the sort of formation of my interest is actually interdependent, then I'm trying to express my views, but also negotiate them with the people around me. And so in the second model of politics, then groups are a much more kind of durable and important understanding. And the kind of problems that we have to solve are problems about interpretation, about how we form commitments, how group loyalties become positive as opposed to negative, all these different kind of things. Whereas in a deliberative model, the kind of problems that we have to solve are problems about aggregation and deliberation, and representation and so on. And both paradigms of politics exist in the world out there, so we're not saying that one is, but that I think right now a lot of the conversation around the relationship between AI and democracy focuses a lot more on the former and less on the latter. And so what ends up happening then is that we're less good at thinking about the way in which AI technologies can be used to solve problems of interpretation, of commitment, of power differentials, things like that. And so part of what we're trying to do in the paper is by laying out the alternative paradigms, try to make the case for the way in which we should focus not just on one, but both kind of models. And so I think one of the places where we align with some of the work that Jillian and her co-authors was doing is that we treat institutions as socially created constraints on human behavior, right? So an institution isn't like a building in Washington, D.C., although it is that also. It's not just a norm either, but right, it's a set of collective decisions that we make about how we want to constrain ourselves from being purely individualistic actors. And those, therefore, are constantly being formed and remade over time. And so the AI as a technology itself, we can treat as a constraint, right? As an institution that we can socially create to constrain or enable certain kinds of behaviors or not. And so what we do in the paper then is begin to look at processes where we treat AI or the kind of technologies not as static institutions, but instead as emergent systems that form where the kinds of questions we should be asking are questions like, what are the feedback loops that we want to build into our technologies such that we enable and solve the kind of problems of interdependence and commitment and so on that we need to solve. So I will stop there, and thank you.
Thank you very much. And at the image, you were set up against the Habermasian canon that now is expanded. So that's very good. Over to Luke, and I think we will also expand the conversation further from stated preferences that we've been talking about in different forms to also revealed preferences. Or
I will speak from here. I don't have slides, but yes. So notwithstanding all the very extensive discussion on how complicated democracy is in practice and how rich a concept it is, I'm going to be talking about preferences in particular, and particularly the ways in which, in some collective decision-making processes, stated preferences are being supplemented with inferred preferences, preferences that are predicted. So crudely, you could think of this as supplementing stated votes with predicted votes. And this is one way in which AI is sort of incorporated into democratic institutions and processes. It might be worth saying up front that it's actually not that hard to predict people's stated preferences to a reasonable degree of accuracy. We're very social creatures. If you know enough about how people like you would vote, it's quite straightforward to extrapolate that to make inferences about how you personally would vote. And there's up to a certain natural limit, which is that our stated preferences, we're only so self-consistent. If you ask me to fill in a ballot paper a week from now, I'll only be so consistent with my own preferences that I state today. And so up to that sort of natural limit, it's relatively achievable. And this is already happening. Can I get a show of hands who's heard of polis or remesh? So quite a large number of people. But you can think of these as surveys where the person administering the survey doesn't set what all the response options are. They set some remit, and then the survey participants contribute their own response options, and everyone else can vote on everyone else's response options and say whether they agree or disagree or are ambivalent. And so polis has been used most notably in Taiwan, but also by governments of all levels all around the world to inform policy making. Remesh is a similar platform that's been used by the UN in lots of conflict regions in Iraq and Libya and Yemen, and most recently in processes in Israel and Palestine to surface common ground. So these systems use inferred preferences. So they do ask participants to vote on some subset of what everyone else has contributed, but they also extrapolate those preferences to map out the space of what everyone might say if they had voted on every single submission. And so inferred preferences are already being used. There's appealing reasons why we might want to use inferred preferences. So basically, what we're doing here is lowering the burden of preference elicitation on voters, which might allow us to use democracy more often for more frequent decisions, to make democratic decisions over in domains where there's just simply too many alternatives or possible alternatives to ask people to fill out a ballot. It might allow us to expand representation to people who are unable or unwilling to vote. And it might help us to sort of systematically explore the space of new alternatives that no one's put forward yet in some automated way. These are just possibilities. I'm not necessarily advocating for any of them. But we also arguably also use inferred preferences already quite extensively, at least implicitly, in democratic processes. Even the most faithful representative doesn't have complete information about what their constituents want, so has to make sort of educated guesses or predictions. And even there's fundamental limits to stated preferences as well. Our stated preferences are some estimate of what we might want if we'd had more time to think about it and deliberate on it and better take into account what everyone else wants and so on. But of course, there's obvious problems with predicting people's preferences, which are that you might predict them incorrectly. And so inferred preferences can diverge from stated preferences. And the paper that will be published in a few weeks is sort of exploring the extent to which we can mitigate those, it might be possible to mitigate those, that divergence, such that the use of inferred preferences could be considered consistent with democracy and political representation as those terms are commonly used. So we sort of take a fairly comprehensive approach to this and sort of step through all the ways that democracy is justified and so on. But for the purposes of this summary, I think I will focus on sort of two buckets of concerns. The first is that this accuracy point in inferring preferences. So if a lot of the justifications for democracy hinge on whether inferred preferences are consistent with those justifications hinges on how accurate the inferences are. And so we might want guarantees that are worst case guarantees that make no assumptions about the distribution of preferences in the population, but could nonetheless guarantee that our method of preference inference guarantees some high level of accuracy. And we summarize sort of technical results in the paper that basically say that at least using current sort of methods for preference extrapolation, it's not really possible to get high certainty high guarantees on accuracy without also significantly increasing the amount of data you need to collect from people. So if you're trying to use this in a domain where there's a large number of alternatives, to have high guarantees on accuracy, you would need to ask people to fill in ballot papers that cover almost as many alternatives, which sort of defeats the purpose of using inferred preferences in the first place. So there's this fundamental trade-off between how much data you collect from people and how certain you can be in whether the inferred preferences are accurate or not. But I think the second interesting point that emerged in this work is that there's a bunch of other desiderata for democracies and aspects of how representation is defined that aren't related to accuracy, but are things like democratic decision-making is sometimes justified because it makes us better people in having to consider what other people want, and through the process of deliberation. And you can imagine if we relied too heavily on inferred preferences, we lose that aspect, that human involvement aspect. There's elements of how democracy is justified that touch on accountability and contestation and consent. And so it's important that someone is taking ownership for the decisions that are informed by the use of inferred preferences. And there's elements that touch on sort of public justification, which is that's loosened as you move from stated to inferred preferences. So if you're designing a process that uses inferred preferences, it might make sense to design it in such a way that there are still good reasons being given for the decision being made. And I'll finish with just, in the paper we list some recommendations, but just one sort of space of recommendations which I think is important, is that you can imagine a spectrum of collective preference aggregation decision-making processes from fully stated to fully inferred preferences. But in practice, there's a whole space of hybrid processes that make use of both to get some of the benefits of inferred preferences in terms of scaling to greater numbers of alternatives and so on, but some of the legitimacy of stated preferences. And in practice, this is how they are currently used. So I'll give two examples. One is where traditional elected representatives use these processes like polis and remesh to inform their own decision-making, but they are ultimately accountable for the decision being made. So that's a kind of hybrid process. And similarly, you could run processes like polis or remesh to generate options and sort of hone in on a good set of options that seem like strong candidates, but then have a stated preference ballot to ultimately determine what is what happens. And that's an approach that's been taken in some of the UN processes with remesh. So I will finish there. But
thank you, Luke. Yeah, we can come back to that also in the discussion later. And I think it was also nice to pass us back to Julian's point around preferences in the previous panel. But I think we're at the moment in time also where we're in a big AI revolution. It's dominating media news. We're also in a moment in time where there's a lot of conversation about democracy, not just in this country, but around the world. So if you're sitting in the panel and asking yourself, are we really asking the right question here in the panel? I think we're asking ourselves the same. And with that, also over to you, Spencer.
So thanks, Katie. Thank you so much, Seth. And just the Knight First Amendment Institute as a whole for your leadership, pulling us together here. My writing typically deals with statutory reforms and other legal solutions, because that's like the best way to get a placement in a law review, right? So I welcome the chance to shift gears, break out. And so I wrote my essay for civil rights groups, community power building organizations, and philanthropic institutions. You know, these are folks who have fought for a long time for racial justice, for voting rights, but they've largely been sidelined in AI debates. My essay introduces them to both the harms and benefits of AI for racially inclusive democracy. It also offers them an on-ramp and a roadmap on how to engage and help shape the underlying technologies, corporate practices, and law to advance racially inclusive democracy. So now, on harms, I highlight bias, cultural homogeneity, ethno-nationalism, manipulation, surveillance, digital exclusion. In terms of benefits, I lift up language access, boosting civic engagement and voter turnout, and civil rights enforcement. I also flagged community organizations using AI mediation tools to understand both majority and minority preferences among their constituencies to, identify areas of consensus, right? Now, what I didn't include in my essay, but central to today's conversation, is the potential for AI mediation tools to manage some of the challenges of racial polarization in the U.S., which is often the most significant demographic factor shaping voting patterns. When I was writing a longer law review article, I went deeper into this topic. I'm a fan of Danielle Allen's work. I certainly believe we need bridging ties to create a connected society. MH was generous with his time in terms of engaging me with his work and his area. Now, with regard to racial polarization, I'm concerned that bridging technologies could either not work or could affirmatively undermine pluralism by favoring assimilation and homogeneity, right? Different technologies operate differently, but I'm concerned that downranking substantive conversations about race while elevating safe content that ignores race could suppress important discussions about disparities, police violence, attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, more, et cetera. Right now, granted, Bridging technologies may also downrank, white nationalist positions, but this compromise seems to be an unsatisfactory return to assimilation as the price for a racially inclusive society of, black women having to straighten their hair to get a job, or students on recess being prohibited from speaking Spanish. I also understand, as MH writes, that the goal of bridging technologies is to surface common ground, not to collapse diverse opinions into a single perspective or to manipulate participants into agreement. But to the extent that automated deliberation changes perspectives, I don't know that we can avoid questions about manipulation, right? And those questions won't just come from communities of color, they'll also come from people right now who are experiencing cultural anxiety due to demographic change in the US and Europe and other places, right? Also, even if an algorithm can aggregate preferences and find common ground, there's no guarantee that some people will agree to share that common ground with me once they realize that I also live in that neighborhood, right? So finally, my concerns may not be with the technology, but by wanting the technology to do too much. I do not view our most significant challenge as one of moderation and civility versus radicalization and polarization. I see the deeper tension as between pluralism and ethno-nationalism. To me, the danger isn't that people disagree, it's that we erase race, language, culture, difference, and call that democracy. So I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Spencer, for a very thoughtful provocation, but also for breathing life into all of us late this afternoon. I want to pick up right on that point of what can we reasonably expect these technologies to do when it comes to either enhancing or transforming the way democratic deliberation works. And I want to turn back to you, Emma. And so you also included some real-world examples in your paper that you had done before. Can you talk a bit about what you have seen in terms of evidence how these technologies work in different contexts, and perhaps especially where conflicts are involved?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to all the other speakers for the great talks. I'll definitely mention the evidence. But first, I wanted to introduce something that I feel like was in Hahrie's talk and Spencer's talk, a distinction that I'm thinking about a lot these days, which is like, well, explicitly in Hahrie's talk, like deliberation versus kind of group-oriented negotiation. Or I might think of it as, and in Spencer's talk about pluralism versus assimilation. And I might also frame it as, do we agree prior to the deliberation to the rules of the deliberation? Or like, is the group already sufficiently in common ground or sufficiently kind of aligned that they will accept the outcome of the deliberation? Versus the groups are not aligned, and there we in kind of antagonistic political conflicts, you have mechanisms that we, quote unquote, all agree are like fair mechanisms, like voting. That's kind of like what we do that keeps the democracy quite stable, that we like all agree that like voting and, counting the votes is kind of the mechanism of aggregation. So even if we like viscerally disagree, we still agree about the mechanism. And so like AI is of course like not at that level where we like all agree about the mechanism, but in a case where you have a sufficiently homogeneous group, they might agree that this mechanism is useful for their purposes, especially if AI provides benefits where you can, through like an AI mediated deliberation, you get an outcome that you can see is high quality and sort of the, it's an outcome-based measure. We have a good outcome, versus the other one is a process-based measure where we all agree that the process is something we want to agree with. Okay, so this distinction basically like groups are like in conflict, they're not sufficiently homogeneous that they agree to the process, or they're sufficiently homogeneous that they agree to the process. Now, in our research, we've sort of, we've glossed over this distinction and sort of tried, maybe the AI was doing too much, or just we've glossed over this distinction. And so we evaluated in the Habermas machine project, we evaluated how real UK people from across the population discussed controversial political issues, such as, was Brexit a good idea? Or should we raise the retirement age from 66 to 68? Or should we make the asylum-seeking policy easier for people to enter the country? So these are divisive political issues in the UK, at least at the time of our study. And we found at some level of granularity that the system kind of worked well for helping find common ground. But one thing that I realized in our project is that our deliberation protocol has a mixture of both AI-mediated deliberation and voting. So how the process went was, as I stated, people wrote their opinions. The model generated a few candidates for them to vote on, and then kind of the winning candidate then proceeded into the critique phase. So this sort of combined this deliberation and voting procedure. And so I think that some of the benefits that we kind of observe may be also a result of having this sort of like uncontroversial aggregation process of voting inside of the deliberation. Yeah, okay, so that's a lot. I hope others will respond.
Okay, thank you for that. I will come to you, but just before that, because you mentioned also this concept of homogeneity and how homogeneous different groups are, I think this was also looked that you wrote about in your paper about how effective the predictions of inferred preferences are in different groups. So can you perhaps talk about how you discover that in your research, but also what are the policy implications of that, in which context one could even consider using inferred preferences?
Sure. I might characterize the distinction slightly differently, which is not between homogeneous and heterogeneous populations, but between essentially easy to predict and difficult to predict, or like simple and complex in this prediction problem. And there's lots of work, at least in the context of recommender systems, which focuses on the concern that if you train an algorithm which is interacting with a public in some way, and its goal is to satisfy human preferences, it will, if it has the ability to, figure out a way to influence people's preferences so that they're easier to satisfy. And I think this touches on the evidence point as well, is that we're, in the social media context, but also in the AI context, we're in a world where the companies that build these tools really resist efforts to rigorously measure the impacts of their technologies and the ability to tell whether feedback loops of this sort actually exist, or to what extent they're playing a role. You can certainly imagine this kind of thing happening in a more democratic context if we're using AI to mediate democratic decisions. I think, given the lack of evidence, it's hard to say anything conclusive about what the recommendations are, but some other work of mine sort of suggests that if you're predicting preferences with a model which is less expressive than sort of the complexity of the real world, it's optimized to minimize its average error, it will always have some tendency to, or a slight bias towards the higher probability regions of that preference distribution. So in simpler terms, it's always going to have some bias towards the existing clusters and mirroring back the existing clusters of the space of preferences or opinions, which, that's potentially a problem.
Do you want to pick up on that, Spencer? I saw you.
Yeah, actually, so I just want to throw something in, just a question here for you, Luke. What do you say this is hypo, you can't attribute this to anybody. No one's ever said this, right? This is just a hypo. It's academic. We're in an academic institution. What do you say to the civil rights leader who says, hey, white voting is about 65%, black voting is about 55% in terms of turnout, Latino and Asian American is about 10 points below that. I'm going to give my community an option to opt in to automatically cast a vote. And basically, based on their kind of data patterns, et cetera, it doesn't necessarily have to be what my organization says. It can be what the inference is in terms of how they'll vote. This will vote for them, and we're going to close this turnout gap here. So in terms of, obviously, we want everybody to participate, but is that like fake participation in terms of folks that we should just kind of dismiss and dispel?
I mean, my quick answer would be to advise you against setting anything up like that at all at the moment. But and there's moral issues around should people have the ability not to vote. I'm an Australian where we have compulsory voting, so I've got views on that. But
right, but this is people making a decision themselves, just like they make a decision to opt into all these payments that they have and they overpay here right now in terms of their charge card, right? Individuals make that decision.
Yeah, so if they, and maybe they've got the chance to review it, but this is just sort of the default option. I think, for the sizes of the constituencies you described, you could probably, for most democratic decisions at the level of granularity that we vote at the moment, predict the outcome fairly accurately based on some subset, like a random sample of the population actually stating their preferences. But that's a long way from saying that you should do that in practice, and there's lots of reasons why you shouldn't.
Look, I think, Hahrie, you also want to comment there, yeah?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this hypothetical that no one's ever said comment that Spencer made, which is that I think, to me, this is part of the reason why the paradigms of politics that we have really matter, because that to me, that model of politics is based on an assumption in which the way in which people participate is they're invited to consume a spectacle that other people are putting on, right? And so if we have a model of politics that is basically a spectacle, and in the United States, every 2 to 4 years, we're invited to consume and choose which spectacle we want, right? Then why wouldn't I just outsource my vote or whatever the thing is to something else that can minimize the cost of participation for me? And I think this relates, MH, to the point that you were making about the way in which people kind of trade process versus outcome, because one of my favorite definitions of democracy comes from a political scientist at Cornell, a woman named Valerie Bunce, who sort of said that democracy is unique among all other forms of government because it invites people to accept uncertainty over outcome in order to have certainty over process. Right? So you don't know if your side's going to win or lose, but what you have is assurance over a set of rights and responsibilities that you're going to have in the process, which is the opposite of authoritarian systems in which we know if Russia has an election, we know who's going to win, right? We don't know how he's going to get there, and so that's the trade-off that we're making. And so the question is then, if you're trying to improve democratic outcomes, what are the choices that you have? Well, one thing you can do is try to minimize the range of outcomes such that people will be willing to make that trade-off, right? Which is what I think that's what a lot of policymaking is trying to do. That's why we create social safety nets, that kind of thing. I think a lot of the kind of deliberative work that we're doing is trying to give people assurances that there's a minimum range of outcomes that they have to buy into. The alternative is that, you can, that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation, I think, gets less attention, which I think is underlying a little bit of what Spencer's question is how do we expand people's sense that they actually have voice, that the rights and responsibilities that they have in the process actually matter, And so this question, not just of where do my interests come from, but how do I exercise my voice in a way that is not just something I can outsource, to something else, is, I think, part of the key challenge that we have. And so, And so this is where it's like, I feel like we want our technologies to be working on both sides of that equation, and that we want to think not only about what the range of outcomes is that we're offering people, but also what is the invitation that we're offering them? And are we inviting them to do more than just consume a spectacle or in fact be agents within it?
So a few more pointed questions, and perhaps we can do a bit rapid fire so that we get through also and leave plenty of time for audience question. The first one is to you. I think Luke mentioned that the big labs developing this technology sometimes also resist attempts for full transparency or evaluation of some of the downstream impact. How can researchers, academic advocacy group compete with well-resourced organization in really evaluating this model and build the kind of pro-democratic systems that you imagine? And how can we in this community support that effort?
Right. So number one, I think that this is a long-standing question, right? Whether it's like a David and Goliath type of a piece or, kind of Gandhi or, kind of civil rights movement. This is a long, a big question, right? So I don't know what the definite answer is. I do think that not resisting technology, when I say not resisting it, I mean using tools, figuring out how to use tools as opposed to just saying we're going to completely reject tools. And, I do think that is an important component here. So as you all probably know, there are a variety of organizations. I kind of lay some of them out in my my paper in terms of how folks in this room can help. I think there's two components, right? One is organizing. How do you use tools to organize here and learn about these? So think about like the AI and Democracy Movements project here at Harvard here, or N10 on that side. I think another part of it is just getting up to speed on some of the policy issues at play here and developing relationships. So, Fight for the Future, Human Rights Data Analysis Group, Surveillance Resistance Lab, there are some others there. I think engaging in substantive relationships, like being on an advisory board, being available and responding in terms of email when folks ask a question, MH knows a lot more about this stuff than I do, and he's just been so wonderful and nice in terms of being responsive to questions and just being available to folk here, I think is really important.
Thank you. And actually building up exactly on that, on communication, I think one of the things you talk about in your paper is the feedback loops, yes, that we've always had mediations for communication, but that also shapes what comes out of that deliberation. So how can we ensure, if we work with AI-mediated deliberation, that those feedback loops and communication actually promote constructive debate instead of distorting that and contributing to increased polarization?
Yeah. So, So one of the things we talk about is the idea that, we want, in order to kind of scale the kind of outcomes that we want, then we want to have feedback loops that'll naturally sort of enable the sort of natural human interactions that people have to sort of lead to the kind of small d democratic outcomes that we're seeking. And so, because we're sort of arguing for needing to take kind of groups and like durable institutions more seriously, the kind of things that we're thinking about are sort of, feedback loops that would enable the same kind of small d democratic outcomes in non-digitally mediated spaces. So, for example, Eleanor Ostrom and her partner have a lot of work on the importance of like dynamic polycentrism, and so do we have feedback loops that enable kind of shifting nodes within social networks that have like polycentric sort of distributed networks of power? And you can kind of examine sort of things like that and like are the kind of civic architecture, to use Alondra's term, that we're creating through the technologies that we develop, are they enabling that kind of polycentrism, or do we see kind of static, nodes kind of forming? And so I think there's a lot of questions like that would create a different kind of evaluative mechanism than what we might commonly see.
Thank you. And before we open up to audience questions, I want to talk a bit about guardrails, because these are powerful technologies and kind of potentially large-scale effects. So starting with you, Luke, in terms of, first of all, inferred preferences, what is the rationale behind inferring preferences from one kind of survey data instead of inferring preferences generally from data around people's online behaviors or other kind of data sources than survey data? And what do you think should be the guardrails and limits of governments using inferred preferences for democratic decision?
So on the first point, I think in the context of like a polis or a remesh, you're getting data which is very tailored to the particular alternatives that are being considered in that context. So I guess you have much more direct access to the preference structure of the population and it can probably make more accurate preferences. But there is work. So for example, there was a recent paper from Michael Bernstein's lab at Stanford where they basically interviewed people or had a language model interview people for 2 hours about everything about their life and their experiences and their preferences and so on. And then they used those transcripts as context for a model to predict how that person would respond in experiments and showed that they could predict with sort of 85% of that natural limit I described, so 85% of the extent to which people were self-consistent. So that's one model where you could use general information about a person. In terms of guardrails, I would probably advise against the use of inferred preferences by government, but potentially I think it's defensible to sort of start experimenting with them within the kinds of hybrid systems that I described, where there is a person who can be accountable for the decision that's ultimately made, and they're just using this to sort of supplement other public input processes or processes for gathering data about what the public will is. That would be one model which I think would be okay, but certainly we shouldn't just like outsource binding decisions to inferred preferences at a governmental level, I don't think.
Thank you. And ending up with maybe a slightly more philosophical question, the Habermas machine. Building on a very rationalist tradition, it's maybe, shall we call it, almost expected that we end up with a machine in the end. Do you think that there's a particular reason why we're doing a Habermas machine? Do you think other political philosophies around democratic deliberation would work equally well to codify into the kind of experiments and data-driven decision-making that you are experimenting with?
Well, I could imagine building like an Ostrom machine, which would kind of highlight, maybe as a variant of the Habermas machine, like the architecture was such that you have this like candidate generation, and then you have this like personalized reward model or like vote prediction thing. And there's no reason why this has to all be controlled by like the same entity. So for example, like we could each have our own kind of personalized reward model that we develop each, independently using, maybe some of it is, it doesn't even have to be a machine. It could be you. You could show up and vote on the candidates, or maybe if you're comfortable having a machine do it for you because you don't have the time to, then maybe like a trusted provider in your community could develop the your own component of this deliberation machine. So I think like there are definitely ideas from different entities that could inform kind of machine-mediated deliberation. I think decentralization is one of those.
Well, just going back to get a little bit more from you, MH, on this notion of groups. And what's the role of groups in terms of the Habermas machine? When we talk about like language providing meaning and life and moving toward language that is kind of uniform that we all share, what does that mean in terms of groups and pluralism? Obviously, we've got sometimes people are a bit down on tribalism. And I think that there are a lot of tribes who resist that. They feel like that there's this kind of geographic based, kind of UK notion that the way to organize the world is in counties and states and gerrymandered districts and states as opposed to other ways. So talk to us about groups and how you thought about groups in the past and how you're thinking about them moving forward in terms of your work with kind of deliberative technology.
Yeah, I think, deliberation could work for groups, like if for multiple aspects of groups. Like I think about participation. If you're trying to boost participation in democratic functions, voter turnout or whatever your form of participation is, if your representative or process is more responsive to your needs, and insofar as AI mediation can facilitate that, make the representative more responsive.
But there is a suggestion of, hey, we go directly to the individual and have a conversation so they're not pressured by groups, which suggests that interaction with the group is not necessarily a good thing here, right? And so I really go to, where is the group in terms of the big decision? Not just, can groups use this tool? I agree they can. I said they could in my paper. I'm good with that. But do groups have a role in terms of the Habermas machine, in terms of the big universal questions that we're trying to get to?
I mean, yeah. So I think like there are maybe two modes in a very, very group-centric view. One is deliberation within the group to find common ground, common cause, and that could be an interactive, iterative process where people feel like their views are represented better and also feel more solidarity with those in their group. And then there's a very a more tricky level, which is deliberation between groups, which is much more like negotiation. And for that, I mean, this is much more speculative, and like I'm not sure we know yet exactly how AI can help mediate between groups.
Yeah.
One thing that like would need to probably be in place is like agreement on the negotiation mechanism. So for example, if you just inserted AI into negotiation right now, the like negotiators would probably give the AI information they don't care about, say like, oh, we care about this. And then the AI would negotiate, come up with some negotiated proposal, and then the real negotiation would start. So, I think just inserting AI into that is not going to be, we're not there yet, but
I take that opportunity to also open up the floor. We start a few minutes left, so we have roughly 15 minutes for audience question. I have some here on the screen and some here, so we'll take every second to make sure that we have. Please, also state your name and affiliation.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jim Dingman. I'm a journalist, so I come at this from a different perspective. And I want to suggest that I've been involved in public media for 30 years plus. A governance structure that might be interesting to think about is the Community Advisory Board structure that will be eliminated if NPR, PBS, and public media are denied funds in the new budget coming up. But that structure operates at the local grassroots levels. People are elected from communities, and they come and advise public radio and TV stations. My question is what we're living through right now. The first 100 days of Trump. Is AI getting a bad rap or what? Because it's being used, if we see the evisceration of the federal government underway right now, AI will be, I'm coordinating reporters covering this right now. AI will be brought up as a justification for these massive eviscerations of these institutions in Washington. Just last week, Howard Lutnick, in one of the Sunday talk shows, admitted the whole concept of reindustrialization, which we just saw the market crash as a result of these tariff bills, that the people are not going to get jobs. Robots are going to do the jobs. So the question is like AI to the layperson out here watching this go on for the past 100 days. Well, I don't have to tell you. We're all sitting here looking at this as participants, either we're Americans or not. So what are we supposed to take about all this? Because it's right now, to the average person, it's operationalized right now. I want to know what your take on that is. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think in previous panels today, there have also been some conversation around the economic impact and the labor market impact and what jobs, if any, remains under a highly capable system. But if we think about from the democratic aspect, would anyone from the panel like to come in?
I could briefly respond. So broadly, like AI is a tool. It can be used for ends that are better or worse. But I think there's we should avoid giving up on potentially positive ways in which we can incorporate AI into democracy and society more broadly. And it's right so Spencer raised potential failure modes with bridging, which is something I've worked on. I think it's completely fair for the burden of proof of showing that these positive use cases are desirable and don't fall into such failure modes to fall on the people who are proposing them. But it's also a failure mode to dismiss them when there's like a whole design space of potentially positive use cases that have opened up. And we've only just started ideating in that space, let alone rigorously testing it. So I don't want to abandon too soon.
So I'm trying to learn more about this area here. But I think the literature that focuses on AI governance, a lot of it is focusing on governance generally in terms of AI. I think that there is this unique question in terms of governance with regard to tools that are adopted by a government that is supposed to be a democracy and responsive to people here, right? As opposed to one individual implementing something, et cetera. There are a number of folks who have started to write about community councils to oversee locality, adoption of risk assessment tools in terms of algorithms, predictive policing, surveillance, and other tools. I think my big question is, I want to do a little bit more research on the literature with regard to that on the federal level and what's the democratic role in terms of oversight of these tools. I don't mean to block. We definitely need innovation, but I think that there also need to be some levels of democratic oversight with regard to the adoption and the maintenance of tools.
So we will come back to audience questions. Should you also give the people who have used the QR code a chance? So let's go through the panel in a rapid fire way. Please keep it very brief. The question is very concise. What are the most radical examples of proposal for AI-enabled democracy that you have seen made? Radical examples. So what are the most radical proposals you have seen for how to use AI to enhance democracy?
I think the one that was brought up earlier of voting on behalf of people is quite radical. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity for voter education using AI.
I mean, insofar as we think like civic practice is also part of democracy, I think the kind of outsourcing of our social life to AI companions is radical in a lot of ways.
I'll just add to MH's point that there's been lots of proposals and some examples of governments not just, so instead of voting avatars, but using language models as sort of taking the place of SPADs or advisors in government. That would be another radical proposal.
I think certainly what you all have said, although I do think we need to deal with this tension between how do we reduce barriers for people in terms of participating, how do these tools serve people. I also think this concept of, eliminating elected officials and having AIs negotiate with one another in terms of representing us, that are AIs that aren't interested in entrenchment, et cetera. The argument goes, this is like Bruce's big thing, that's kind of radical.
And if I were to add my own example, I'd probably go with tax policy. So I think one of the core functions of the states is really the ability to raise tax from population. And I think there's a lot that could be automated there by AI agents and potentially even close loopholes that are out there and do an automatic. It would probably be pretty radical because I think there's strong interest that would push against such a radical transparency, but it would be one. Back to...
So Mike Albrecht, I'm a early stage founder. I guess my question is about kind of definitions, because I think there was a lot of acknowledgement up front that there's a rich and complicated set of what constitutes democracy. And I think it's really easy to just say that and then kind of move on. And that's also a way to kind of abstract from that richness and those actual specifics. So I'm kind of wondering if we can get back a little bit to some of that. And so I think the range is really wide, and I'm thinking a lot about what you're saying and what else that sounds to me, and I thought about this Habermas machine and kind of going directly to the people and gathering their preferences, not necessarily having debate among people, and it sounds a lot less like U.S. democracy and a lot more like what China calls democracy. So I'm just wondering, maybe there's some slippery slopes here. And what exactly is kind of the bogey, the vision that you all have and we want to get toward? Because
we're rebranding to digital canton or something like that. But perhaps the political scientists among us should start.
Yeah, maybe I'll just to add on what I said. So I think that part of what we're arguing for is that what has been lost in the way that a lot of people conceptualize democracy, if we conceptualize it in the way that you're describing as just like a majoritarian aggregation of preferences, which is definitely part of what democracy does, but not solely what it is, then what we lose is a very kind of Deweyan conception of the way in which democracy plays a role in constructing people's sense of themselves as a public, and then that has like a fundamentally sort of collective aspect to it. There's a political philosopher named Bernard Crick who kind of has this line where he sort of says like, politics are the public actions of free men. People. But the idea being that like politics, small p politics emerges when we move out of our private spheres into the public sphere. And that has a fundamentally kind of like collective and public aspect to it. And that's so much deeper than just aggregating preferences and identifying majoritarian outcomes. And because so much of the way in which media, for example, covers politics focuses on elections and things like that, we mistake that for democracy itself. And part of what we're arguing is that we want our AI technologies to enhance not just that, but also the construction of publics too.
So time is quite a merciless opponent. We only have a few minutes left. What I would ask is, why don't we pick 2 questions at the same time, and then we do a final round through the panel, and you choose which one of the question that you focus on. Okay? Please.
I want to actually first say thank you to Hahrie and Henry. I think that your paper is a very necessary intervention into a literature that has been under-theorizing democracy in ways that are really dangerous, in part because of the last question. And to give an example and ask you a question. So Zhao Chang, who you may know, China Digital Times, theoretical physicist, Tiananmen Square, becomes human rights activist, telling a story about how the Chinese Communist Party reacted to American Idol. And he was like, the practice of democracy, and it wasn't that people got to vote in China for idols, it was that they were organizing. They were doing group formation, and that what was so problematic for the Chinese political party wasn't the voting, as somebody just described, but it was the understanding and learning and figuring out your preferences in a group, right? It was political formation. And I think that's a really concrete example to show the ways in which the theories really manifest in practice. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you think the kind of research we need to kind of understand democracy as practice.
Thank you. And it seems like we need to complement the weightlifting and the truck lifting, maybe with some sort of group gymnastic to have that analogy full. Second question before we do the round. Yeah?
Yeah, mine is tangentially related. I'm Nick, and I'm a software engineer. I really appreciated the approach to consensus, but Spencer said something that made me think. We are thinking a lot about the broadness of consensus. Like that's like what I was getting a lot is like, how do we get something that 80%, 90%, 95% of people that it works for them? But how do the systems that we build also prioritize durability of consensus? We can have something that's very popular, but some legislatures only meet once every 2 years, so there's limited opportunity to revisit. So I'm curious as to, related to education, how people develop their views. How does consensus stick around?
So Spencer, why don't we start with you this time, and then we come in, and we don't want to entrench too much on the closing remarks, so please keep it to 30, 40 seconds each.
Okay. Just quickly, I need to think more deeply about the durability question. I think it's important. There's a public education component to it. Certainly, I just went to Germany, and there's remembrance culture significant there, and we're dealing with a lot here in the United States with regard to remembrance or what we don't want to remember. I think that has something to do with it. I did want to just talk about the group piece and what is democracy. Immigration and Naturalization Act 1965 transformed our country just as the Voting Rights Act did. We are different, and that's a good thing. And we need basically systems that can respond to that and acknowledge that as opposed to suppress and deny that. And so that's just what I would end on.
Just briefly respond to the durability point. I think, consensus and durability are both just 2 points in the whole space of desiderata that we would want for collective decisions, and that's even using the narrow, thin notion of collective decisions as preference aggregation and not the richer notions of democracy. I agree that there's lots of other things other than consensus, and often consensus is not the thing you want to measure, but we've got a lot of work to do to be able to support all those different desiderata.
And just on Deirdre's question, I think so much on this question of what is the research that we need to understand these different forms of democracy, but a couple key questions is, I think, key off the word that you use, which is this idea of political formation, which, questions I would ask are things like, what is the way in which AI can be used to enhance people's sense of their own agency as opposed to undermining it? What is the way in which AI can be used to enhance people's sense of commitment to each other, to a form of difference without domination versus undermining it? What are the structures? What is the way in which AI can be used to form structures that enable durable groups, that are able to contest and struggle for power? Sort of those are the kinds of questions that are fundamentally, I think, political questions that we want AI to be involved in, as opposed to pretending that they're not there.
Regarding the durability question, I think interaction and iteration, also public consultation and being responsive to feedback. I think understanding the norms in institutions and having mechanisms that can aggregate all of this, mechanisms that are fair, that people trust, and that are responsive to feedback, and a living, breathing mechanism. And in order so that people feel like their democracy is responsive to them.
Yes, thank you all. And just on a closing note, I think Arvin started today with saying that AI is a normal technology, but even as a normal technology, technologies as they evolved, societies and our institutions do too. And many of the terms that we have been using here in terms of liberal democracy, our assemblies, even terms like working class and capitalists really came out of one technological revolution in the industrial one. So maybe we don't even have the vocabulary yet to actually articulate some of the institutions that we need in the AI age. So more work for the philosophers in the room. Great thanks to the panel. Join me in an applause for all of them.